welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for joining me today. Today, my guest is Cody McWaters, and if you're not familiar with him, he is an ARIA award-winning producer, engineer, and mixer based out of Brisbane in Australia. And he's worked with a bunch of great artists, including The Chats, Felony, King Stingray, Selfish Sons, and a bunch more. And he's really well known in the Australian scene for being the guy to go to help develop your sound. And we definitely dive into that in this interview. We talk about some of the different ways that he helps artists discover the direction they want to go with their music. And he shares some really cool tips as far as what he likes to do to help push the boundaries of what artists are used to doing and how to implement some new textures into their sound as well. So we get into his processes for that, and it's very, very interesting. We also get into his process for creating clarity in tracks, because when you listen to some of the artists that he's worked with, there's a lot of different layering going on in those productions, but yet every element still sounds very clear, very detailed. So I wanted to talk about how he goes about approaching creating clarity in his productions and where it all starts and how he goes about approaching it in the recording stage or the editing or mixing stages. So I think that there's a lot of really great stuff in this episode. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Cody McWaters, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going, man?
Good, thanks, Mike. How are you?
Doing great. Thank you for getting up super early to chat today. I know, like in your time, it's like 5. You said it was like 5:30 right now?
Yeah, 5:30. But no worries. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Appreciate it. For people who might not be familiar with you and your background and like what you're working on these days, can you give us that story of how you ultimately got into music production and what you're up to these days?
Yeah, it was kind of by chance, actually. I loved music pretty early on and started playing guitar when I was 11. And then after school, I didn't really know what to do. I kind of looked at a few things and knew that I didn't want to necessarily study an instrument or anything, but someone gave me the idea to study production and that side of things. And yeah, I kind of just gave it a shot and ended up being obsessed with it, as a lot of us get. And yeah, I've just kind of done it ever since. It's kind of one of those things where things just kept rolling, and I kind of ended up somewhere cool and I just kept going.
So were you a musician yourself?
Yeah. I definitely played a lot when I was a teenager, and then I probably put it down for a little bit while I kind of focused on production and engineering and stuff like that. But ultimately that ended up forcing me to pick it back up.
Nice. So then as far as that like learning process goes with like learning the production side of things, where did you go to like learn that kind of stuff? Or was it, like a lot of trial and error, that kind of thing?
So I studied at the Queensland Conservatorium over here, and it was kind of a bit different. Like you're kind of placed with a few different cohorts. We've got the music technology department, but then there was classical and jazz, and yeah, those were things that I was not familiar with at all. And there was a bit of kind of commingling with that side of things, but ultimately, as you know, like a lot of those people play in bands as well. We were kind of placed with other cohorts throughout the conservatorium, like the jazz and classical, and that was really interesting because I'd never kind of set foot into any of those things. I was kind of grew up just on rock music, so definitely opened my eyes, but that kind of led to a lot of other things because all of those people played in their own bands and had projects, or they played for artists, and that led to a lot of work and a lot of different projects, but also ended up being where I kind of formed most of my friendships. It was kind of like almost I kind of didn't expect it, but that's how it's happened, and it was really great. There's one guy in particular that I, by chance, had a session with him, and I was just assisting a student a year above me, and I just got along with him really well, and we have worked together for the past 10 years now, I think, on so much different stuff. And it's one of those weird things where if I drew a diagram of all the stuff I've done and where it came from, it mostly will go back to him, just from meeting him and working with him a lot.
And who was that? Is that Doug Roberts?
No, actually, it's
because I was going to ask about him. I knew that you were mentored by him too.
His name's Ben Shannon. He's a jazz drummer. He was actually in Canada recently at Banff with his band.
Nice. That's cool. Well, so you talked about like how at the school you got kind of roped into working on lots of different styles of music, and that's something that I was going to ask you about as well. Like when I listen to your discography, you have a lot of different styles of music that you work in. Everything from like the rock, pop, indie, and more. So I was curious to ask, like, is that something that you're intentional about, like wanting to work in different genres of music, or are you the kind of person that would like rather just niche down and be like a rock guy or something like that?
No, I definitely like to work on a lot of different stuff. I think the change of mindset keeps it all fresh for me and exciting. Like it keeps the job fresh too, and forces me to think a lot more, which is good and bad. But I really like to just kind of almost create a mindset for a particular project and roll with that, and that kind of shift is really good. And I think in Australia too, like the pool's a lot smaller, so you kind of have to do that starting out. But now I kind of end up going for, I don't know, just if I like it. Like I listen to a lot of different music as well. And often if I can like relate something I like to an artist in a way and I enjoy that, then that's a good sign for me. Or even if it's something completely new, like.
Yeah, it's interesting because like, it's hard enough to sometimes master like one genre and get really good at like being like the metal guy or the rock guy or whatever, right? Or the pop person, whatever. So as far as like keeping on top of like trends in music or like making sure that when you're working on different styles of music, it's like compatible or consistent with like other records in that genre sonically, like are you listening to a lot of different artists in those genres and like using reference tracks and stuff like that?
Not overly, to be honest. Like I might have a discussion with the artists about what they like or what they've been listening to lately, but everyone kind of has the same response, which is like I listen to a lot of different music, and then I try and just dig deeper and be like, all right, well, show me your recently listened to on Spotify, and we go through that and we start talking about that, and that's where I find I get some nice answers, and just it's kind of more just as a working out their current taste overall and how they want their music to, I guess, sit alongside that, or what they want to draw from that to using their music.
Yeah, it's interesting because like I also feel like a lot of artists, if you ask them like, who do you sound like? So many are just like, I don't know, like we just sound like us.
Yeah,
Like they're
yeah.
giving this like super vague answer, right? So I kind of like your approach of like, what do you listen to? Because that's usually going to be pretty similar to like where their influences come from, right?
Totally, and often they might not know that, and it'll take me going through that with them to point that out. And then they're like, oh yeah, I guess that's true. Some people are really aware of it, but others aren't. They just know what they like.
Yeah. And I guess too, like finding that sonic palette of a band, like, if you listen to a lot of different stuff that they listen to, you kind of would get a sense of like, oh, maybe they're fans of big sounding drums or like really atmospheric tracks or something like that, and you can kind of get a sense of where they're going. And I'm sure most of the time bands come in kind of with that sound somewhat defined, but maybe they need a little bit more push to get there all the way.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's so much of it that's inbuilt, but then it's kind of just putting it all together and making sure it all works together, and yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we were talking about mentorship like a minute ago, and you mentioned your friend that you work a lot with right now. But I know that you did also work with Doug Roberts, who in himself, like he's a well-known producer in his own right, and has worked with a lot of artists. Curious if you could dive into like working with him and like what that experience was like, and maybe some of the key lessons that you learned from working alongside him.
Yeah, he's the best. So he was one of my lecturers when I was at uni at the conservatorium, and when was it? I think it was start of second year we had him, and you could just tell that he was this guy that had done a lot of good stuff, but was extremely humble and so nice and so quiet. And I think that was probably when I really like kicked into gear. Like I was just inspired by that and him generally. And, beyond having him for lessons, I would very occasionally jump in on a session with him, but probably wasn't until my third year or even after uni that every now and then I would just hit him up saying, hey, do you reckon, you could have a listen to this mix for me? And then that kind of turned into using his space a little bit to do some tracking. And, some days I'd go down and he'd just help me with a mix for the day. We'd just open a session and go through it. And that was awesome. Like, so invaluable and so rare, particularly here, to have someone like that. So I'm forever grateful of Doug and how he helped me along the way. Like, he was so generous with his time. And as far as what I learned, I think it was the little things, like just going through a mix and seeing how he did it and just trying to apply that to my practice. He did a lot of things that I never thought would work, but they somehow do. And I learnt so much from him in that way. Like, even if it was just we were trying a new plugin out for the day because this is how I've been using it or whatever. He always seemed to have a great answer for what something needed, and for a long time it was never what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. And I think that you brought up something that's kind of an interesting topic too, which is that, like, you said you would watch him do all these things that you didn't think would work, but he would make them work. I think that that's like part of that learning experience is like, you can see someone do all these tricks and like to your admission, like you didn't think it would work, but it's like more about understanding like why those things work in that context. So it's not just like slapping a preset or something like doing the same thing on every single project, because that might not always work, right? It's about like really getting to the core of like, well, what is the sound? What am I trying to actually achieve? And like, this solution works because of whatever, right? So it's interesting that you kind of got to observe that and see some of those things that maybe didn't seem like they would work, but ended up doing that. Are there any examples of anything like that you can think of?
Oh, not off the top of my head, to be honest. It's been years since that, but I remember that feeling of just being constantly surprised and, reflecting on it. I think that's something I've really put into my practice too. Like, but I guess more in an outrageous way. Like, sometimes I like being silly with an EQ and just having fun or using things that you don't think would work. Like, recently one of my mates found an old Zoom bass pedal, and my first thought was, that's destined to be on a song soon. And I threw it up and I'm like, okay, that's not a bad start. And then we found this fuzz tone that was amazing, and it made it onto a song. So I keep joking that I'm going to bring back the Line 6 Spider, and I don't think that'll ever happen, but I'm going to try my hardest, I think.
Just got to put it on insane mode, man. That's the best setting.
Yeah. And rip it.
Yeah. Well, it's funny though. It's like some of those old tools that you kind of just like discount immediately, like they can create some really interesting things. And I know that like one of the producers that I follow around here, I love his bass tones. And I found out for the longest time he was using one of those Line 6 pods, And so it's like, hey, maybe sometimes the secret is in these like obscure tools that nobody like even thinks about anymore,
I think so. And I think there's some fun to be had with some of those things too, And like, I find too, that's can be the thing that gets people excited in the studio too, is when you're like, I'm going to try this outrageous thing, come along for the ride. And people do. And I tend to have a lot of fun with people when we do that, exactly that.
Of course. Yeah. It creates an experience. It creates like this moment in the studio where you're like, you kind of all come together and like have fun getting the sound and creating things that, you wouldn't expect to do. So very cool. Well, speaking of like finding sounds, like I do know that one of the things that you focus on a lot in your career is like finding new talent and like helping them develop their sound. And I know that we talked earlier about like how you'll use like a Spotify playlist to maybe get a sense of their interests and stuff like that. But like, as far as helping bands discover their sound or like refine that even further, like what other processes do you implement in order to help people with that?
Very good question. I guess I'd say like part of it is probably like helping them understand what's good about them too, because, artists don't often see that, a lot of the time, can be quite self-conscious and maybe a little insecure of what they're doing. So I feel like part of my role is understanding what makes them them and relaying that to them and telling them why it's good. And I think that's really important too, because artists, I think, need that sometimes, like that confidence boost. Yeah, damn, that was a good question.
I agree with that, though. I think that there's a lot of artists that are very self-conscious, and because of that, they have a hard time seeing the things that make them unique or the things that are like their greatest strengths. I was recently working with a band, like just mixing their tracks, and I remember like they sent me the rough mix, and it was just like a vocal and like the harmonies and stuff are like so buried. But like when I got the mix and I started boosting up those harmonies, like, man, this like makes the band sound like so epic and good. But like the singers were self-conscious, and that's why they buried it. And they're like, can you turn it down? I'm like, no, this is like your superpower, Like sometimes you need to like help bands just kind of like reveal that in their stuff and like give them, like you said, like give them that confidence that, this is something that makes you sound unique or different and stand out. And I think you're right. It's helping them find the things that maybe they underestimate about themselves. As far as like sonically, like how would you describe your process with helping them maybe as far as like tones or that kind of thing? Or do you even get involved in that too much? Like, are you kind of just more or less like let them kind of have their own tones and that's kind of their sound, or what's your involvement in that kind of process?
I mean, I feel like that changes artist to artist for me. If I feel like someone has got a really clear handle on what they're doing in that respect, I'll let them go and I'll pipe in when I feel like I need to pipe in. But other artists, it is a like really active process of exploring that. And say if it's an artist that predominantly plays guitar, I'll try and get away from guitar because often, if I'm meeting people when they're a bit less experienced or they're kind of just getting into it, their experience has been with an instrument, and I try and delve into the other side of that, like not so much synths, but kind of I really like to run things back through pedals or basically like a lot of granular processing. So running things back through granular processing and then resampling that and then putting that into a song, and maybe even just taking the structure of your song and the chords and then sampling that through granular processes or stretching algorithms or something, and then bringing that back in and kind of resequencing the song with that stuff first up. And I think that really opens a lot of people's minds, and I think that's kind of like a lot of the job done straight away for a lot of that stuff. And then when they're less worried about filling out something with chords or like setting a harmonic bass, it's already there. So I guess the role of the guitar might change a little bit more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like you're kind of helping them discover this landscape of textures in their mix that like everything kind of can reshape around, I guess, right?
Yeah. And I feel like it just changes how you think a little bit and how you approach it from that point on. And an artist that might want to have more textural or synth-based music, often that is a thought after the arrangement has been written. So there's so much less room for that sort of stuff to exist. But when you kind of pull everything back and start with that becomes the foundation. I guess that's kind of the biggest thing with working with a band that may have, been more of a traditional band but want to go into that territory. Like you almost like throw your instruments in the bin and let's start again.
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's two artists that you've worked with that I would love to dive into your process of working with them. But like, the first one is Felony. Like, man, I only recently discovered Felony, and like she's definitely like one of my favorite new artists that I've heard in a long time. And I just love like what you've done with those tracks. And to me, like, you're talking about like running things through like granular processing and stuff like that. And I can hear some of that in those productions. And like, there's definitely a lot of cool textures to those. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that project and like, what it was like getting involved in that and kind of seeing that from the ground up.
Yeah. She's amazing. We actually started working together when she was 16. So she's very young. But straight away I heard her demos and was like, oh, this is awesome, I think working with her for both of us has been a really like explorative process. And I think that even kind of working on that with her and how closely we work together, that informed a lot of how I work now, even though it doesn't feel that long ago. I feel like there was there was a lot of turning points in there, and probably the most I've ever pulled my hair out over mixes before, and you know, we just went to the other side and happily made it back. But yeah, I think that's the same thing too. Like if I am exploring something new, I guess a new idea or a new piece of technology, I'll drag her along and we'll go through that together, and we'll end up usually making something really cool. And that stuff is all over that. And yeah, there's so many things that are like a really good spanner in the works, Like I remember we had tracked one song and I was like, oh yeah, these guitars are sounding sick. I think they're done. And she was like, no, can you just mute these guitars and we'll do another part? And it was a totally different part. And internally I was like, I'm not sure because this is so different to where we were. But, I learned very quickly that I can actually trust Layla, and, we just roll through it and then see what comes out on the other side. And like I used to tell people when we first started working, I'm like, I'd start an idea and then she'd go, what about this? And she'd play it back to me and I'm like, that's way better. I'm like, let's do that, But yeah, she's great.
That's awesome. Yeah, it sounds like it sounds like you guys have been more like collaborative and in terms of like how you guys work and just like really taking the songs wherever they can go, as opposed to like maybe more of a traditional, like, here's my song, record it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. I think that's kind of something I try and do in some capacity generally, but with her, it's been a completely different journey. It's just, I remember, this is a funny story I actually tell people, but one song we were working on, I did a mix one night and I hit play at the end of the night and I think I even played like the first maybe 10 seconds of the song or even the first chorus or something. I'm like, all right, that sounds really bad. I'm going to go home. And I got home and sat on my couch and watched mixing tutorials, which was funny. It seemed like such a crazy reaction to it, but it was actually good. Just I'm like, no, I want someone to throw me something different and something that I'm not thinking of or something simple that I'm really missing. And then the next day I went in and got most of the way there with it. So I was like, oh, that was actually funny. I thought the whole notion of going home to watch mixing tutorials was funny at the time.
Well, I guess, yeah, sometimes you just need to get out of your head, maybe try something different, and that in itself can just create some creativity in your process and give you a new perspective on your tracks.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Do you feel like, as far as your workflow goes, like, do you have a pretty similar or consistent workflow that you generally do, or is it kind of just like every project is a different way of approaching it?
I think for the most part, everything is different. I'll generally just try and work out a starting point and then just let it flow from there. Some people are different. Like often I'll set everyone up live in the live room and we'll track the song and then kind of work out where to go to afterwards. Like a lot of artists that, I probably know I don't need to interfere at that stage. So I let them do their thing and I might throw them some notes while we're going, but I kind of just will leave them to their own devices to a point and, I'll dial in the sounds and things like that. And maybe there'll be some discussion of instrument choice or amp choice or drum tuning, stuff like that. But, if I feel the need to really interfere in that process, I'll maybe make some recommendations on the fly, be it structural or whatever. But often those discussions have happened before the studio.
That makes sense. Like, yeah, I guess you have to always have those conversations ahead of time so that going into it, like what direction you want to take a project and how involved you want to get, versus like maybe letting a band have their own approach and their own sound and taste and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, totally, for sure. Sometimes I, find myself for half the day maybe just hitting record and then giving some small feedback each time, or even just telling them that they're doing a good job and it's sounding good. And then it might be once we get to overdubs that I start getting a bit more hands-on. Yeah, it just changes so much.
Yeah, that's a good way of approaching it too, because then like the foundation of the band's sound can be the way that they expected it to be, and then you can kind of pepper in some extras that maybe enhance the tracks a little bit more. So going back to the Felony stuff, like when I listened to those tracks, like those productions have so many different layers between like guitar, synths, bass, like samples, electronic stuff, vocals, and all that. Like there's a lot of good stuff in there. But yet your mixes sound super clear, and you can definitely hear like every element very, very detailed and clearly. And so first off, great job on all that. But secondly, like when it comes to like your general philosophy for approaching clarity in a mix, like what is that? Like how do you generally approach your decisions with getting that clarity?
I think the place I've come to every time is working out what really needs to be the focus. And I remember one of those songs in particular. It was actually a really interesting thing where I felt like we were often choosing, it's like, okay, are the drums mono or stereo? And there's one song where I remember we ended up with mono drums, but the toms were kind of the only thing that was stereo. And that was a real light bulb moment for me, because I was kind of like, of course, if the drums are in the center, there's more room on the sides now. And I think it's just some of those panning choices. And a lot of the time I'll be using really quite heavy filtering as well, particularly on the ambient sounds. Like it's so crazy high passing a sound that's quite ambient or textural, and then to a point where you think is good, and then bypassing it and bypassing the filter and then realizing how much was there. And, you know, it's those sort of things that I find chew up a lot of space really quickly. So I think doing that, being a bit harsher than you think, and then, you know, backing it off later if you need to. But it's so interesting. I feel like a big part of that was me just poking around for a long time, you know, and there was often never a set thing. It was kind of just exploring at every stage, even the mixing. But, you know, it was one of those sort of processes too, where I don't think we really had a marker of where the production finished and the mixing started. I think it kind of slowly all happened until we decided we weren't going to add anything anymore. And then we finished it off with a lot of those songs.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That kind of makes sense. And especially when you're talking about like recording things in mono or panning things like in mono and then having toms off to the side. Like I was curious to ask about, like, you know, when it comes to that approach of focusing on clarity, like, is that something that you typically would be focusing on, like, as far as the arrangement goes, or are you already focused on like those decisions in the tracking stage, or is it all just kind of mixed decisions? Like, it seems like a lot of people have different approaches to that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the only really conscious choice there is like working out what to mute later, because that's the thing we've definitely gone through. Is we've got too much stuff, or this part's not sitting well with this part, like let's get rid of it. It's probably a bit closer towards the end, but we definitely go through stages of like doing a bunch of stuff and then going through and muting some of it or deleting some of it and then adding more stuff and then culling it again. And I feel like some songs we went through that process many, many times and did eventually get to that point where we're like, all right, it's great. Let's finish it off. You know, let's put a bow on it and call it a day.
Yeah. That's interesting though, because like, I think you bring up an interesting point about muting tracks, because like that in itself has so much power. Like you can really clean up your mixes just by like reducing the layers. But it also kind of goes back to what you were talking about with like the high pass filtering. In the way that you described it there, like maybe thinning out a sound and going real extreme is the best way to do it. And it, just because you had low end in the original recording doesn't mean it needs to be there, right? So it's like, it's identifying what is actually fitting best in this mix and what is contributing to the overall sound, what's causing problems for other instruments in the mix, that kind of stuff too. So, you know, not being afraid to strip things down, I think, whether that's frequency wise or just muting a track in general, I think that's all really important stuff to help everything fit together.
Totally. Yeah. And it can be hard committing like that sometimes too. I find like you just have to trust your instinct and roll with it. I think like it's so easy when you kind of, this is kind of relating it to my experience, but taking a bit of a shot in the dark with stuff like that, it feels easy to be like, oh, but what if that's not right? Like, what if that's going to haunt me later or something? But I think that's where I kind of learnt to just to roll with things a little bit, was that project, and just kind of, I don't know, same thing. We just ran so many sounds through other different things, and then even back through some of my outboard and got it back into tools. And that was a means of, all right, we're committing to this idea. Like we're committing to the next stage of this idea, and we're going to keep rolling with that.
Yeah, it's very cool. It's definitely interesting, like that topic of commitment, right? Because I feel like a lot of people have a hard time committing to sounds just because they're afraid, like, oh, maybe I gotta go back, or And I guess it all depends on, like, you kind of described it as how you weren't sure if like the production side from the mixing side, if like those weren't they weren't separate stages. And I think it's all about like getting sometimes clear on that, like, are we going to have a project that we're mixing as we're producing, or are we going to separate those stages and then like get very defined on the sound and then record that and mix it a certain way? I guess it all depends on like whatever approach is leading to the best results, right? And helping people be the most creative with it.
Yeah, that's right. And kind of circling back to Doug as well, I think that's the biggest thing I learned from him was just being a little bold and committing to things as you go. Like, I think a lot of the time, actually, I can be pretty heavy-handed on things as we go, but I think can be important for the overall vision of a song, if it's clear. Sometimes it isn't, and it's okay. But if you have a really clear vision of what you're trying to do, just try and execute that as quickly as possible, or as early as possible, sorry. And that was his reason too, was like, try and make it sound as finished as possible as you can every step of the way. So I think that's something I really picked up there and have always tried to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's great. Another band that you've worked with that I think would be probably, I don't know if you would feel this way, but like they seem like they're the total opposite of Felony, would be the Chats. And I love that band. I love that band. I love like their kind of no frills, just straightforward punk sound. Very early Ramones-ish kind of thing. But like working with a band like that, like, does your approach change, or is it like same sort of deal where like, okay, maybe we are going to experiment a little bit more, that kind of thing?
It does change a bit. Like, I knew I wanted to have a bit of fun with it, and I didn't want to set up a standard kind of drum mic setup, for example. My whole approach for that was like, let's just try a few kind of almost silly things and see how they go. And I also remember being terrified to do that, but I was like, I think this will work, like, and my role in that project felt like it was more, I was just facilitating the thing for them, and I'd give feedback on takes or whatever, but ultimately it was them kind of driving that a bit more. But some of the things I remember doing was, actually got a really funny photo of it, but the guitars are mostly I think it was a Bassman head, Fender Bassman, with the Dan Electra Honeytone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of those just cranked on the floor with the mic on the floor in front of it. It was like an EV PL5, and it sounded awesome. Like, you turn up your main guitar tone and then you just put a bit of the battery powered amp into it, and it sounded so good. And yeah, I remember having a lot of fun with that album. I think I used a 157 as an overhead as well, and just kind of, I don't know, kept it simple. And like, I remember pulling all of these sounds and being like, oh, that sounds pretty cool. Like, that's cool. And then they came in and had a listen. I remember Eamon going, sounds sick. I'm like, sweet. All right, we're on, we're good. And I think it was after the first song I threw up maybe 2 more mics, but I was pretty happy as well. And I remember sending it off to be mixed, and I'm like, oh, I hope he doesn't hate this. Like, I hope he's okay with what I'm delivering him. But there were, I never ever heard anything like that from him, so I guess it was okay. And I think that album ended up sounding really cool.
Absolutely. Well, it's funny because with a band like that, like, you got to work with them after they had already had some success with their previous EPs and stuff. So, I feel like a lot of bands with every record they make, like, they wanted to start to sound a little bigger, a little more polished, or, like, it's like you kind of see the progression of a band and the development of their sound as their discography moves on. But with the Chats, it's like, I definitely feel like there's still that equal amount of rawness to that record that you worked on compared to the previous ones. Like, there is a consistent thread between all of their work. But did you feel like, did you ever have that in the back of your mind of like, maybe we do need to like refine this a little bit more, or like kind of expand what they're known for?
No, I don't think so, to be honest. Like, I knew if it sounded too good, they wouldn't like it, but if it sounded too good, it probably wouldn't fit what they were doing either, if you know what I mean. Like that's just kind of how I tackled it. And we had some, we met up for a beer beforehand and just spoke it all through, and I went and listened to some of the records that they were into, and that was kind of my point where I'm like, I'm just gonna do it this way and see where we end up.
Yeah, it's cool to hear you talk about how like you were experimenting with some stuff, because I'm sure like it's that classic case of like when you have the information, when you know how to do something, like for example, like how to mic a drum kit, and like you're used to micing it with like 15 mics or whatever. It can sometimes feel weird to not do it that way for another project, but sometimes like that simplified way of doing it is the best way. And so, yeah, I imagine that like it must have been kind of interesting for you to be the engineer and thinking like, is this going to work? And figuring out how to make it work with that sound, right?
Totally. I really thrive off like pushing myself outside of that comfort zone too. So I think that's what like makes things really exciting for me and for others as well. But probably mostly me, to be honest. But that was definitely a thing where I knew I was doing something that was out of my comfort zone, but I kind of just felt like it was going to be cool, and I went with my gut, and yeah, it ended up being pretty cool. So yeah, it is almost like unlearning some things at times, isn't it?
Absolutely. But I guess at some point though, like just as much as it's unlearning, you're also learning how to do something really cool. That's like a different way of doing it,
Yeah, totally. Kind of goes to that old saying of like, you got to know the rules before you can break them.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Well, I mean, again, that record sounds awesome. So like great job on all that. And yeah, to me, it's like I said, there's still that energy and rawness to that band. And, I think that a lot of that has to do with like the way that you tracked everything. And it's cool to hear about the little Dan Electro thing, because kind of adds some of that extra character to their sound that, kind of gives them that raw feel and, the energy of the guitars and all that kind of stuff too. So definitely cool to learn more about that.
Thanks, man.
As far as like your mixing side of things goes, like what's your general mindset when it comes to mixing? Like, do you have a specific place that you like to start, or like a specific workflow to that? Or I guess is it dependent on the project?
I've got quite a basic template that I use for every song, and that kind of is, I think, for the most part for routing's sake, but it also has a bit of a few chains that I guess it's what is my most consistent at this time as far as mix bus processing goes, drum bus, parallels, stuff like that. And I have a few options on maybe some of those to flick through, but it changes quite a lot. I think my main focus is always the vocal, straight away, the lead vocal. Yeah, it's interesting too. Like I sometimes don't know where to start, and I might find where to start, and then I'm sweet. Most of the time it is with the vocal, but I feel like sometimes it's a real chicken or the egg situation, Try and do as much of a kind of top-down approach as I can, but...
And when you say top-down, like, are you approaching it from, like there's a top-down approach of, like, starting on your master bus and working backwards that way, like to instrument buses and individual tracks? Like, are you approaching it that way, or do you mean, like, top-down thinking, like, as far as the priority of the different instruments and working that way?
Yeah, probably the first way you described. So starting with the master bus and going through that way, and I'll generally set, things like thresholds to where I kind of might have had them on the past few mixes, and then kind of mix into that a bit. And then, as the process goes on, I might find that I need to adjust that later on. But that's kind of the starting point. And often I try and listen for things that might be hitting that too hard, and then just working out why they're hitting it too hard, whether it's a frequency thing, or if they needs a bit more control. Once you deal with one thing, you might hear the next thing, and then so on. It's kind of generally how I'll go about it.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm always intrigued by people who do that top-down approach, because like I just can't work that way. Like I guess I maybe like I always start with individual tracks. Usually get like my rhythm section, my drums, my bass, like kick, snare, bass, and then I'll throw on like a master bus compressor and work that way. Like I'll build everything up around it. But as far as like starting from a master bus, it's an interesting approach that I'm always intrigued to learn more about people and who are doing it that way.
It's definitely stressful. Like, I think you kind of have to have a few things in place for that to work from the start. Like, sometimes I'll throw it up and it'll be an absolute mess, but that'll be my cue to start maybe leveling or start compressing these things that are jumping out a bit too much. But yeah, it's definitely, sometimes it can just spin me out when I get it all going and it's, feels extremely squishy or something's not happening the way it should straight away. But I think, if it's a project where it's gone from production into mixing, I probably have gone pretty ham with plugins. So I'm probably already compressing things more than others, and there's probably a bit of room for me to, I guess, start there,
Yeah, I guess you're making those decisions all the way through the process. So you're already aware of what's going on at every stage of building it.
Yeah, so in theory it should be easier, but I have a habit of making things difficult for myself like that. So
yeah. So then with all this stuff, like, how do you know when you're done with a mix?
When it's due is probably the right answer. No, I think I will probably get to a point where I'm feeling pretty good about it, and then just send it off. I think I had to really acknowledge early on that, like, okay, this is as good as I can get this right now. I can't. I remember thinking that when I was younger, like, this is going to be the best mix ever or the best mix I've done. And it's just, the reality is not like that. It's like, okay, this is good, as good as I can get it right now. I've listened to it on my trusted systems. If I'm really not sure about it, I'll get a friend to listen to it or something. And even my partner, like, she's not musical at all, really. So she's a really good tester. I'm like, let me know if anything jumps out.
Absolutely. Yeah, sometimes you need that person that isn't technically minded to be like, is there anything that's obviously wrong?
Yeah. I'm like, and then I'm like, you don't think the tambourine was too loud?
Of course, right? It's like when you point out those things to someone, then they're like, oh yeah, maybe.
Yeah, but it's always a good sign if she listens to something and she doesn't pick up on anything.
Yeah, usually when you're playing it for like those non-technically minded people, it's like no reaction is the best reaction. Like nothing stands out. Yeah. So then for you, like, at the end of the day, like, what ultimately makes a great sounding mix?
I always use this language with my, like, people I work with, but I think the big thing is, as long as I'm convinced by it, if that makes sense. It's kind of like I always talk about it with guitarist, and particularly there's one guitarist I know, but say to people, I'm like, he's so good, he's the most convincing guitarist I've ever seen, because when he plays, like, every note he plays, I'm believing every single one. Like, he's doing his thing and he's doing it so well. It's interesting, like, flipping between, like, what makes a good mix that I would listen to, or what makes a good mix that I do.
Do you feel like there's a distinction there?
Yeah, definitely. That's a good question again. It's one of those things I often will have a pretty simple criteria, and it's often like, find myself liking the sound of albums, if that makes sense. So, like, a body of work, and God, that's good, Mike. I don't.
Sorry to stop you so early in the morning.
Yeah, no, that's a big question. I think as long as I can feel what the song's trying to put out, it's like, that's a good mix. That's a job well done.
I think back to what you said earlier about, like, feeling convinced, like, as long as you feel like people are getting their point across, like, the musician, like, the parts are there, the energy's there, the emotions are there, like, those kind of things. Like, those are the elements that a lot of people connect with. So having those be a prominent part of the song is, I think, a very important thing.
Yeah, totally. And just as an overall thing, like, there's always those songs where you hit play and you feel the vibe, or you feel what that song's trying to do in the first 5 seconds of the song. And I've always really wanted to do that. Maybe I'll listen to something I've done, and I have, but I don't really know off the top of my head.
It's always hard to, it's interesting that you brought up that idea of, like, what makes a great mix that you've done versus someone else, because it is so critical. Like, we're so critical of our own work that it is hard to, like, say like, yeah, I make great mixes, you know, but like, there's obviously a point where we often get to where we're like, okay, this sounds like a song. Like, I'm happy with this, and like, I can end this. It sounds good, you know?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Kind of wondering what that point is. I don't know. I might just listen to it and go like, all right, I don't really want to tweak anything anymore. It's like, I know I could, but maybe that's too much if I'm, you know, maybe I don't need to turn that thing down 0.5 of a dB right now. Or it's like, no, it's fine. And you know, it is really hard to zoom out in that situation too. So just try and find ways to zoom out. Like I might even just throw it on my phone and leave my phone somewhere and walk around the house or something, or just putting it in scenario that's different to my everyday, or, you know, like testing it elsewhere, but trying to listen passively as opposed to critically listening all the time.
Yeah, I like that. That's a great answer, because I definitely feel like, yeah, when you're staring at your session and you see all the tools in front of you, it's so easy to just be like, I can grab that. Like, what if I mess with this setting here or whatever? But it is so important to just like, yeah, like you said, like kind of have that passive listening experience to see like if, again, it's like showing someone who's not technically minded. Like if something jumps out at you when you're passively listening to it, then you know there's a problem. But like when everything's in front of you, it's so easy to just be like, oh, what if I try this? What if I try that? And I think you're absolutely right. Like, take it outside of the studio, listen to it somewhere else, and try to detach yourself from being in work mode and just listen as a fan. Well, Cody, this has been great. Like, I've really enjoyed learning more about like your approach to working with bands and helping them discover their sound and all that kind of stuff. And like I said, like you've done some awesome projects that I love. So it was really an honor to get to chat with you today. So thank you very much. If people want to learn more about you, maybe even work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Just on my website, which is www.codymcwaters.com, or on Instagram, which is cody.mcwaters.
Awesome. I'll include those in the show notes for sure. Great, man.
Thanks
again.
Mike.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Of course. So that was my interview with Cody McWaters, and I really enjoyed learning more about his process and how certain projects, it's more about expanding the sound of an artist and being more experimental. And other ones, he knows how to strip it back and let the band be the one that drives the ship a little bit more. And I think that there's definitely a important balance that we need to strike as engineers and producers whenever we're working with other artists, where we need to know what our role is and how we can contribute or how we shouldn't contribute sometimes. So it was cool to learn about how he handles working with different artists. And, you know, the two artists that we talked about in this interview, Felony and The Chats, those are both awesome artists, complete opposite ends of the spectrum as far as sonics go. But those are really great projects. And I think that they can really showcase a lot of diversity in his productions there. I also thought it was cool to hear his approach to creating clarity in mixes and how there's lots of different ways to go about approaching it, whether it's in the arrangement, whether it's in panning, whether it's in mixing, the sounds that you're getting on the way in. All of that is really important. And I liked hearing his approach as far as sometimes stripping things away from a mix, whether he's doing that with high-pass filters or whether he's muting tracks. I think that that is a really good skill to learn because it's so easy in digital recording to just layer and layer and layer. And we often think that when we do that, we're making things sound bigger, but often layering can add a lot of muddiness to a track. It can take away the clarity of other instruments that are maybe more important. So it's a really good skill to know how to dial things back and strip down the sound a little bit. So it was cool to learn more about Cody's process with that as well. So yeah, I really enjoyed that episode, and I hope that you did too. If you did enjoy it and you're not already subscribed to the podcast, please make sure to do so. That way you're notified about every new episode as we release them each and every Wednesday morning. Also, if you're looking for help with your productions, if you're not sure how to create clarity in your own tracks, if you're struggling to understand what tools to be using during the recording, editing, or mixing stages, and you're not getting the sounds that you hear in your head come out of your speakers, well, then I would love to help you out with that. And inside of my coaching program, Amplitude, I work one-on-one with my students to help you make your vision come to life. We'll focus very early on establishing what is the sound that you want. And then we reverse engineer that process to help you know exactly what tools to use in recording, how to edit your tracks, and what tools to be using in mixing. Plus, as you implement that stuff, you're going to be getting one-on-one actionable feedback along the way to make sure that you're on the right path and to answer any questions that you have if you ever get stuck. So if you're interested in learning more about this program, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details on that page there. And I'd love to work with you. I'd love to help make your songs come to life and to help you feel proud of the music you're making and to feel confident in your process and your systems so that you know exactly what to do on every song that you work on and get great results every single time. So once again, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude to find out more about that program there. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.